The title today is nozzle selection. And so we're going to spend some time talking about that topic in general, but we get a lot of questions specifically around 360 undercover. We get a lot of calls, a lot of questions about what nozzle should I select. And those of you that know me and my running joke as an agronomist, the answer is always, it depends. But in reality, it really does depend. And if we think about our traditional applications today, we know that there's a lot of different nozzles that we use. As a matter of fact, I just took a picture this morning as I came in of one of our sprayers that's sitting out front. And if you look at this photo, you'll see I call it a nozzle selector. A lot of our machines today have these, so we can have multiple nozzles already on the machine. The applicator can quickly just turn and twist and change their nozzle. Why do we do that? We're going to talk a little deeper about why we have so many different nozzles and so many different options out there today. But if I boil it down, it's really because we spray a lot of different products that require different gallons per acre. They require different droplet sizes. There's a lot of different parameters and variables that come into selecting the right nozzle. However, what I would say is that with 360 undercover, I think we're going to have a smaller group of nozzles that we're going to choose from. So that's the good news. I don't think we'll have quite as array of orifice sizes as well as even just general nozzles. And why is that? Typically because with the 360 undercover, we're mainly going to be targeting fungicide, also insecticide and nutrients, but those are the main products that we spray today. We spray them in crop. We have the applicator down in the canopy. So we start taking out some of the variables. With our traditional spray applications, we're spraying everything from fluid fertilizers, large volumes, to post-crop for weeds, pre-crop for weeds, for fungicides, a lot of different arrays. And so we're going to have a lot of variability in our nozzle size. We will have some decisions to make and variability in what nozzle we select in 360 undercover. But again, I think it'll be a smaller pool of nozzles and sizes that we're going to be talking about. And by the time we get done with this call today, we'll actually walk you through the selector and try to make it fairly simple and easy. So let's start kind of with Basics 101. I know this is review for everybody. I'm sure most of you on the call are applicators yourself, which means you've taken some type of test, I assume, in your state to be an operator or an applicator. But let's just start basic, and we'll go through quickly and get to some of the 300 level stuff here at the end. But, you know, the first thing I like to talk about is what is the goal of the application that we're making? Why are we out there applying? And it's really to have an effective application, meaning we want the product that we're out there to put on to work really well. We want to make the most of it. And how are we going to do that? We're going to really do it through three different parameters. The first is placement. You know, the first thing I think of when we talk about placement is getting it on target, getting it where I want that product. I want it there for two reasons. One is all the active ingredient, all the goodie that's in that product, I want to get on the plant that I want it on, whether it's a weed, whether it's on the plant itself. I want to make sure I get all the active ingredient where I want it. And the other thing is drift, and it's a big deal. And it's even a big deal as we think about some of the new technologies that are getting ready to come on board. But we want to keep it on target so that we don't affect some off-target sensitive species, whether it's a neighbor's crop, whether it's your own crop that's a sensitive crop, whether it's an orchard, a grapevine nearby, somebody's flowers, a garden, etc. You guys know the drill there. The other thing on placement is to get on the specific portion of the plant, whether it's the crop or the weed. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here on the next slide. But we want to get that product, not just, oh, I want to get it, on top of the canopy, or, oh, I want to get it on the soil. I want to specifically get it somewhere typically, particularly even in the case of weeds, as we get into post-spraying on soybeans. I spent a lot of my years on kind of the weed science side in the industry, and we would have water hemp as an example that would get pretty tall. And it wasn't about just getting coverage on the top part of that plant. The more I could get down towards the bottom, the better job I would do at killing the root system. Many times, if I just got coverage on the top, I would kill the growing point at the top, and I would basically kill the apical dominance in that plant, but it would regenerate from the axillary buds below, and I did not kill my my weed. So it's not just about getting it in general in the canopy or in the field. It's really about specifically where. And then we talk about coverage, and we'll talk about this a little bit more. We want to get even coverage, consistent coverage, regardless of the product, but some are a little more important than others. And we'll talk about, I have more concentration, particularly as you think about glyphosate and how that product works. Sure, we still need to get coverage over the weeds, but that product, because it translocates in the phloem of the plant, we want to make sure we get a good concentrated droplet that can get into the plant and move into the plant to, again, kill that growing point. And then timing. You know, it's very critical that as we're making an application, we think about the timing that we need to be. Some labels will tell you on weed control for a post, it may say post-application, get out there when weeds are 4 inches or less. Height is important. If they get too big, we'll have a hard time controlling them. Timing on diseases can be very critical, whether it's a crop safety standpoint or whether it's when the disease is at economic threshold or maybe before the disease gets too established, because some of the products may not have as much curative as they do preventative types of control. So timing is a big deal. So let's talk about what we can control. You know, it's easy to talk about the things we can't control. Oh, the wind, the weather, it's cold, things aren't growing well, the wind is high. But let's talk about what we can control, because there's really a lot that we can control when we make an application. We can control the what, the when, and the how. So let's talk about that. The first one is the product and rate. After you identify the challenge or the opportunity out in your field, you're going to pick a product, whether it's a weed that you want to control and you're going to consult with your retail salesman that you trust or your agronomist or consultant. You're going to pick that product and the rate. So we're going to come back to that, but that's really key, and that's the first thing that we're going to do. Then we're going to talk about timing, like I just talked about in the previous slide. What's the appropriate stage or size of the target? Whether it's a weed, whether it's the crop, whether it's a disease or an insect, we need to get out there at the appropriate timing. Wind speed and direction. I have that under something we can control. We can't control the wind speed and direction. However, we can control when we go out and make that application, meaning if I know I have a sensitive crop on the north side of the field I need to spray, I'm obviously going to pick a day when that wind speed is either, you know, out of the north, blowing away from the field, or blowing adjacent to where I don't think my likelihood of getting drift onto that sensitive crop is very likely. Same thing with wind speed. I know that's easy to say sitting here. It's frustrating at times when we have applications to make and we get real windy days, but sometimes we have to go maybe early in the morning or of an evening when that wind has died down. So we do have some control from that standpoint. The next things that we can control and are very important is the gallonage of the solution that we spray, or the GPA, gallons per acre. And we'll come back to that as we make that decision and figure out how do we figure that out. Ground speed, we can control that. Whether we're running 8 mile an hour, 10, 12, 15, we can control that. Boom height, you know, in typical applications, an old rule of thumb that I used to hear and use a lot was whatever your spacing is of your nozzles, you would come about that high off of your target. So if the target's the top of the canopy and you're on 15-inch nozzle spacings, you'd be about 15 inches off the top of that canopy. Or same thing if it was the bare ground, if you were out putting a pre-down, typically that would be the case. That's obviously going to be a little bit different with 360 undercover. And again, we'll talk more about that. And the last one, which is really why we're here together this morning, is to talk about droplet size and pressure. Something we can control is something that is incredibly important for the effectiveness piece of the particular product that you're spraying, but also for the drift that we talked about. And we're really going to control that droplet size and pressure through our nozzle selection. And that's what I really want to focus on here going forward. So let's go back to the first bullet I had on the last slide, which is we're going to pick our product and rate. After we do that, so we've had the conversations with the right people and we know the product that we want to spray, you know, and I know a lot of us, as we buy a new product, we tend to leave the directions in the box or we throw them away and we think we can figure it out on our own. I'm going to highly encourage you to read the label of the product that you've picked to spray in your field. Again, those of you who've been through applicator training, you have familiarity. They make us understand the label in the different sections, but there's a lot of really good information on that label. I know they're long, I know they're confusing and complex at times, but I want to hone in on a couple things that we can quickly look for on the label as it relates to picking our nozzle. Some labels do a better job than others, but the first thing that I look for is the gallons per acre, either an acceptable range that they'll give me or a minimum. A lot of times they'll say, don't apply less than, for example, 10 gallons per acre with this product, or 5 gallons per acre. So let's make sure and understand that and keep that in mind as we go through our nozzle selection guide here in a little bit. The next is some of them will talk about wind speed and even, excuse me, possibly ground speed. So we think about some of the new technologies that are coming out in the crops and some of the products that have been around a while, like dicamba. They're probably going to get pretty specific with us on wind speed and ground speeds. And then the last one is droplet size. This is the one that I really am interested in if I can find it. Some, again, do a better job than others. Some will get very specific and talk about droplet size. And some may lean towards saying something like use larger droplets, and they're really saying that from a drift management standpoint. Those of you who've been around a while, like myself, when Roundup Ready was launched back in the mid-90s, 96 and 97, you know, we saw the Roundup label go to a specific micron size where they were recommending 400 to 800 microns, which probably falls into that kind of medium to coarse droplet size. We've kind of moved away from talking about microns. It's confusing. It doesn't mean a lot to us. So I'll talk a little bit about droplet category sizing here in a minute. So we've kind of made that an industry standard, which is nice. And some labels will get really specific and talk about, you know, go with a fine to a medium droplet size. Some will say coarse. Again, with some of the new technologies, they're going to lean towards ultra coarse, really, really big droplets. For two reasons. One, drift management, and the other is a lot of those products are, particularly in the case of dicamba, they are systemic. They move in the phloem of the plant. So having that larger droplet is not a bad thing. So back to that, we have to balance the drift management with the adequate coverage of the target, meaning if a label says something generic like use larger droplets, particularly for drift management, what they're really saying is we want to make sure you don't go off target, but that's where I'd have a specific conversation with your salesman or that probably understands those products really well and try to get a little more fine-tuned on what kind of droplet size they're looking for. There's really two categories when we think about herbicides, fungicides, and insecticides. It's that contact and systemic that I've kind of already alluded to. Contacts rely on really thorough coverage of that plant material, really smaller droplets. You know, think about some of the diphenyl ethers and weed control that we spray post in soybeans, the Cobra type products that are out there on the market. Those are contact. The way they work is anywhere that they touch that leaf tissue, they basically explode the plant cell. And so you think about that. If you want to kill that weed and you need to knock out enough of the green photosynthetic material, you've got to get really, really good coverage on that leaf to blow up all the cells you possibly can. So you want to get really thorough coverage. And how are you going to do that? You're going to do that with smaller, more like fine type droplets, fine and medium droplets, than you are bigger droplets. Systemics, on the other hand, while they do need good coverage, don't hear me wrong, they also rely on the concentration of the solution, because that solution being concentrated is going to have more lethal dose as it gets into the actual leaf. It's actually going to translocate, absorb into the leaf, and start to move throughout that plant, you know, through the phloem and xylem potentially in that plant to go to the actively growing point and kill it. So those are going to require maybe a little bit larger droplets. Again, as we think about glyphosate, dicamba, some of those more translocating systemic, and same thing with fungicides. Some of the strobies they talk about, the strobilurins, they talk about being more systemic, while some of the other preventatives maybe are more contact. And you'll see that on some of their labels. So as we move on, and I talk about that, I took a page out of the TWINJET catalog. We've worked with TWINJET pretty closely. there's a lot of good companies, a lot of good nozzles out there. It's impossible for us to work with all of them, but TWINJET's a very good name in the industry, very widely used. So we've worked with TWINJET. They've been great to work with. So you'll hear me reference them a few times through the presentation, but not saying that you have to use only these nozzles that we talk about. But they have a catalog out there. I believe their latest catalog is called 51A. It's a really in-depth catalog of all the products, and it has a lot of good information about nozzle selection. But on page 4, and I just cut a few of their nozzles out, but let's just look at this real quick. They talk about contact and systemic type products, herbicides, fungicides, and insecticides, and drift management, and they rate the nozzles. I chose these 3. Obviously, these are the 3 that you've seen in our nozzle selection guide. There are 3 kind of preferred, or the ones that we promote from a standpoint with Undercover, because they work really well. And I think you'll see why when you look across. The Turbo TWINJET, which is one of my personal favorites, is very good, regardless of whether you're contact or systemic. The TWINJET, which again is one of my favorites, is excellent. That's because of the droplet size and the range that they have, and the ability those nozzles have to produce the droplet size. It's going to work really well whether it's contact or systemic. Contrast that with the XRs, which are a flat fan. A lot of us have run flat fans for years. You'll see they're excellent on contact, and they're only good on systemic. Why is that? Well, it's what we just talked about. An XR, or a flat fan, is going to produce smaller droplets than the other 2 above. And so they're going to be excellent when it comes to contact type products, because they're going to produce smaller droplets. They're going to give really, really good coverage. However, when we get to systemic and we want a little larger droplet size, they're not going to be as good as the others. So I just wanted to point that out. And again, you can reference in the catalog of your company of choice on nozzles. I mentioned this a while ago, just wanted to make you familiar quickly. Droplet categories, this goes from smallest to largest as you go from top to bottom. So fine is going to be that, and I don't have them all memorized, but you're probably in that 150-ish micron size droplet, and then they're going to get bigger as you go down. So fine, medium, coarse, very coarse, extra coarse, and ultra coarse. Next to each one of those, I have the abbreviation that's fairly commonly used in the industry. So kind of be familiar with that, and it'll help you as we go through the nozzle selection guide here in just a little bit. I borrowed this slide from a recent e-blast that we saw from BASF. They had sent out a note on stripe rust. You've heard us talk about a lot of the wheat diseases that are going to be potentially and are pretty bad this year. But I grabbed this slide because I thought it was a really fitting slide for our presentation this morning. So as BASF is out talking about spraying their fungicide products in wheat, you'll see that they have this picture, which is basically, and I don't know how they did it. I don't know if that's water sensitive paper or whether they put dye and just sprayed it on yellow paper. But I really like looking at these because it'll give you a nice visual for when we talk about a very fine or fine nozzle droplet. What does that look like? If you were out spraying through the field as you're going, if you had a piece of paper out there, that's what that would look like. The next one, F/M, it's more of a fine medium droplet size. And the MC is medium coarse. Then we have coarse, very coarse, and then very coarse, extra coarse. So the one reason I wanted to show you is just so you can get a visual of what does that actually look like in my canopy, in my crop, what kind of coverage am I going to get on my vegetation. But the other thing is to point out, what they're advocating here, which is in the case of some of these fungicides, they want to have that really good coverage. And you're going to get that really good coverage with the very fine, and the fine medium. And that's going to be pretty common when we talk about nozzle selection with 360 Undercover, because fungicides are a very common thing that we'll be applying through them. So let's talk about 360 Undercover specifically for a little bit. We've changed the paradigm a bit with this technology. How have we changed it? Well, we're using more nozzles. So if you think about, typically we're using more nozzles than we do today. If you think about a typical application today, your sprayer is likely set up on either 15-inch nozzle spacings or 20-inch or 30-inch. Let's just say you were set up on 30-inch, and let's say you're in 30-inch rows. You've basically got one nozzle per row that you have on that boom, and that's the way we've been selecting our nozzles. So if you think about the nozzles you use today and the size of them, now all of a sudden we're going to either 2 or 3 nozzles per row when we go to the undercover system. So that's going to affect the size of that nozzle, which again we'll get into a little bit, but it is going to change the paradigm a bit. We're also applying in the canopy versus over the top. That changes a couple things as well. We aren't going to think about nozzle spacing like we used to. We're going to think about number of nozzles per row, and we want to talk about row width instead of nozzle spacing, because we're going to have one undercover hanging in each row. So we're going to ask, are you in 20-inch rows or 30-inch rows or 15-inch rows? And then how many nozzles are you going to run on that undercover? So that's a little bit different. The other thing, that we've seen in the data, and a lot of you have seen our data, hopefully you've looked at our yield book. We've seen in our data and our research that using the undercover can increase the effectiveness of some of these products. It really allows them to do what they're designed to do and work really well, because we're getting that coverage and we're getting that placement and we're getting those products put where they are needed. We believe that that increased effectiveness is due to coverage and placement. I just threw this in. A lot of you have seen this slide before. This is a picture of our Miller sprayer coming out of one of our research trials. We don't have end rows, and he's kind of coming out a little bit at an angle so you can really see what that undercover is doing and where it's placing that product and what that coverage looks like. And so we're really excited about that. And I wanted to share some of the results that we had. And again, you've probably seen this before. This was just one of our studies, and we're going to do a lot more of these this year with water sensitive paper to really understand what's happening in that canopy and happening in that crop when we apply with undercover versus maybe our traditional way of doing it with an airplane. Again, our comments aren't meant to say airplanes are bad. They're a great tool. I've used them last year as well, so they're a tool we know are going to continue to be a tool in the toolbox, but we think we have a new tool in the toolbox that can give us some better effectiveness in certain situations. This particular study was one that our research agronomist and myself did, Jason Keenest and I, out on one of Greg's fields, where we went in at V7 corn, so it was still, fairly early in the season, but we ran undercover and then we ran an airplane within an hour or so of the same timing, same field, so we could compare apples to apples. What you'll see is on the left side, the very left picture, is the top of the top leaf of that 7th leaf of that corn plant that we had the water sensitive paper, and you can see that coverage. It looks a lot like the slide I showed a while ago. Very good coverage. And even on the bottom of that leaf, which is the next picture to the right, that's the bottom of leaf 7, and we see very good coverage from the undercover getting the underside. We know some of these diseases and some of these insects can harbor on the back side of the leaf as well, so we think that coverage is important. On the right side of this slide, you'll see the results from the airplane. The first photo, or I'll call it photo 3, as you go across, is the top of leaf 7 from the airplane application, and the last photo there is the bottom of leaf 7 from the airplane application, where we really didn't get any coverage. On the undercover, we saw as we looked down and we put the paper on every leaf down throughout that canopy, top and bottom, we had nice coverage all the way through that canopy. With the airplane, it pretty well stopped or got very, very minimal after we got past the top leaf. Again, not to say it's bad. We just think there's another option to get that coverage when we need it down into the canopy. We're doing things very different. We're spraying 15 gallon per acre with a product right down in that canopy to get that coverage. An airplane, we're running over 100 mile an hour with probably 2 gallon per acre. So very different, but we're going to get different results, we believe, based on some of our research. And so the next slide I want to show you is some data that one of our dealers out in Delaware was gracious enough to share with us. This was one of his fields where he went in. You can tell that's a center pivot, and he applied a headline amp with undercover at V12, and then he came back with an airplane and applied a headline amp, and there was actually 35 plus bushel difference between those two applications. So we believe that here, just getting that coverage and the effectiveness of that product was that much better, getting it down in the canopy where those diseases do the damage from the ear leaf and above. So very excited to get more of this. Again, I encourage all of you as dealers and with your customers, if you can get some of those side-by-side set up this year, I think it would be a great learning and great data for us to continue to learn together. So with 360 Undercover, what decision does this really change? So a lot of you and a lot of your customers have been selecting nozzles for years, but what is it that we've really changed? Well, the primary thing we've changed is our nozzle selection. Generally, we're going to have a smaller orifice size because there's more of them. As I described a while ago, we typically are running more nozzles on that boom than we were in our traditional over-the-top applications. And so that is going to change the orifice size. It may change the nozzle itself, but really the nozzle itself is based more on the product we're spraying, not how we're spraying it. The orifice size is because the number of nozzles that we have on that application. So here's what I want to do. Let's pick a scenario and then let's pick our nozzles. I went ahead and made the decision for us as I put this presentation together, what we were going to spray, but this is the information that you need to know. To be able to actively or adequately and effectively go to these nozzle selection guides, you need to know some things before you do it. And this is a really nice layout of what you need to know. First thing, we're going to spray a fungicide. Second is, I made the decision we're going to spray it at 15 gallons per acre. Just a quick side note on that, get a lot of questions on that. I understand. I used to tender sprayers. I used to spray a lot myself, even commercially. And the lower gallon per acre, I get it. It's nicer, it's quicker, we can get through that field faster, but we really have to ask ourselves, what's the job that we're trying to do and how adequately do we want to do it? And generally, when we get into some of these fungicides applications, the more the better. So I like personally 15 gallons per acre is a minimum. As we get into bigger canopies, more foliage we need to cover, the more gallonage, the better off. You can make that choice yourself, talking to your dealer, looking at the label. Maybe you go 10. Again, that's your choice, but we're going to go 15 in this scenario. We're going to drive 9 miles an hour. I decided we'll use a turbo TWINJET nozzle. We're on a row spacing of 30 inches, and the number of nozzles that we're going to run in our undercover is 3. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So this is, and I don't expect you to read the numbers. I really wanted to show this so that you kind of understand what the page is going to look like I'm going to reference. What I'm referencing here is information from our nozzle, from the nozzle selection for complete under canopy coverage. This is something we produced. We worked with TWINJET to make sure we had all the numbers right in here. But this particular publication is available to you dealers on the dealer portal. I believe it's under stores and forums. You can find it there. We did publish a public link to it here recently in one of our publications where we had an article about nozzle selection, and I believe we'll have this available on our website in the future after we get kind of our categories done. So, but the dealers on the call, you have access to this today. I encourage you to save it, print it out, hand it out to your customers that are using Undercover. So what I've done is I've gone to the right page for the scenario that I just gave you. I went to page 2, which if you look, it says 30 inches. If you look in the gray, kind of the gray part, the light blue part, you'll see that it says 30 inches. It's between the drawing of where the nozzles are spraying down. So that tells us we're on 30-inch rows. And then we have a left side that says 2 spray tips. And then on the right side, it says 3 spray tips. What are we using? We're using 3 spray tips here for our example. So now I'm just going to zoom in on that a little bit. So hopefully you can see that a little bit better on your screen. And I'll zoom in even more here in a minute. But let's start here. So what were the facts that I gave you? I told you we were going to go 9 miles an hour. So we can go over to that 3 spray tip side. We can find that 9 mile an hour column. And I told you that we wanted to spray 15 gallons per acre, right? So I want to go 9 miles an hour and I want to spray 15 gallons per acre. Those small numbers that are in the 9 mile an hour column are the gallons per acre. So I'm going to go down 9 miles an hour until I find 15. So really the first time I start to see it, that I see it, period, is in the Turbo TWINJET 110015. That's the green, kind of, you go to the left of those rows, it's kind of in that green one. But that's the very last number. It's at the 90 PSI, too high. That's not going to work. So I go down to the next nozzle, the yellow one, the 1102, and I see 14.5 and then 15.8. I see those show up at 50 and 60 PSI. So that's an option. And then I go down to the next nozzle size, the TT110025, and I look in the 9 mile an hour and I see 14.5 and 16.5 show up in the 30 and 40 PSI. So that's going to be a good option. As I go down to the 03, I'm seeing 15 is going to show up in around that 25 PSI, probably going to be a little bit low. So if I go to the next slide, I've taken the liberty here and I've kind of cut out all the stuff we don't need to look at, because I quickly figured out that either the Turbo T1102 or the Turbo T110025 are going to be the ones that I want to use. And I got rid of the 2 spray tip side, and we're going to just hone in and really talk about these numbers. The first thing I want to talk about is the spray tip. You see that TT11002. What does that mean? TT is the Turbo TWINJET nozzle. So that tells me immediately that's exactly, anytime I see TT, I know it's a Turbo TWINJET. It's not an XR, it's not the flat fan, it's not a TWINJET, it's not a hollow cone, it's a TWINJET, a Turbo TWINJET. Then the 110, the first numbers that appear after the nozzle designation, is the degree of the pattern that comes out of that nozzle. So you'll see, like in the XRs, you'll see like an 8002. That would tell you it's an 80-degree pattern that comes out of that nozzle. These are called 110, so they're 110 degree. Those of you that know the Turbo T very well know that actually, if you measure and you look at it, these throw a little wider than 110, which is one thing I really like about them. They probably throw more like 125, maybe 130 degree. They're still rated at 110, but they just have a little wider pattern. And I think particularly in 360 undercover, that wider pattern's a big benefit for us. So the first number, 110, refers to the degree of the solution that's coming out of that. And then the last 2 numbers are going to be the orifice size. Okay, so the smaller the number, the smaller the orifice. So an 01 is going to be smaller than an 015, smaller than an 02. So an 02 is going to be bigger than an 015. The 025 here is bigger than the 02, et cetera, et cetera. So we're basically just talking about the size of the hole that's in that nozzle. The bigger the number, the bigger the hole. The number that appears below that, you see a 50 in parentheses, that's the mesh size, the screen that they recommend to use for these nozzles. Just wanted to point that out. But now let's kind of go across the chart. So the first column there is liquid pressure in PSI. These nozzles, different nozzles, are rated for different operating pressures that they work well in. And if you look back at the book, whether it's TWINJET or whatever company, they're going to give you a range. The thing I really like about these TWINJETs and the TWINJETs, they have a pretty wide operating range. They really can operate from 20 to 90 pretty well. I like the 30 to 70 range. I think that's the best. 30 to 60, 30 to 70 is the range that I really want to try to operate within, just so that I'm getting the droplet size I want. I'm maintaining my integrity in my pattern, but they have a lot of flexibility in them, and they're going to work pretty well from 20 to 90. The next column is droplet size, and this is really important, because if you just read the label or you just talked to the BASF rep and he said, hey, for this particular fungicide, we'd really like to target either medium or fine droplet sizes, boom, this is going to be important to you. So then we look at gallons per acre, ounces per minute. Let's not get too hung up on that. Let's go more, because we've done the math for you in these charts, because these are specific to undercover in a 3 spray tip configuration. We know we want to run 9 miles an hour. We said we wanted to run 15 gallons per acre. So if I go under 9 mile an hour, I find 14.5 and 15.8. I don't find 15 exactly, but I know that 15 is going to land right between those two. And I want to come over and I want to look at 2 things. I want to look at what pressure am I going to need to be running to get that output, to get that gallons per acre, and then what droplet size am I going to be creating at that pressure. And I find with the 1102, I'm going to be creating a medium-sized droplet at about 55 pounds, PSI, gets me right at my 15. Now I'm going to keep going down that column, and I want to look at the 025 and see that's going to be a little bigger orifice. So if it's a little bigger orifice, it tells me my pressure isn't going to have to be as high to get the same output. So as I go down there, I find 14.5 at 30 psi. I find 16.5 at 40 psi. So it's going to be somewhere in between there. It's probably going to be about 32, 33 psi is what it's going to take to get 15 gallon per acre. That's going to be more of a coarse type output. Maybe that's okay. Maybe I say, well, that makes my decision. I'm going to go with the O2 because it's medium. The other thing you're going to ask yourself, if you look at that, you're going to say, what if I slow down or speed up? These automatic controllers and most of these equipments today, what they're going to do is they're going to keep your output constant, meaning you tell it you want 15 gallon per acre, it's going to keep you at 15 gallon per acre. Well, what does that mean if you speed up as you're going through the field? Well, it's going to have to increase the pressure, right? If you are constantly putting out 15 gallon per acre and now you're going faster, you're covering more ground quickly, it's going to have to increase the pressure to be able to keep up and keep you at 15 gallons per acre. If you slow down, it's going to have to lower the pressure. So if this were me, I would say, okay, am I more likely in this situation to go faster or go slower? Because if I'm going to go faster most of the time, I'm probably going to go with the 025, the bigger nozzle. So in my case, I might say, you know, we're going to be spraying a big flat field. My son's going to be running the sprayer. I know him. He's going to creep up to 11 mile an hour a bunch. I'm probably going to go with the 025. If it's me spraying and it's a smaller field and I've got some waterways and drainage ditches and things I'm going to be slowing down for to cross and to go through, I may be spending more time at that 7 mile an hour. I'd probably choose the 0.2. Quite frankly, either one of these nozzles for the scenario we painted is going to work just fine. So let's talk about real quick the TWINJET. The two I wanted to highlight this morning are the Turbo TJet and the Turbo TWINJET. So what I've done here is gone to our page on the TWINJET, just like we did the TJet. Now let's zoom in a little bit. So this is the TWINJET, and I can quickly tell that by looking over at the left. Look at the designation. It says TTJ. That's telling me that it's a Turbo TWINJET. That 60 is referring because the TWINJET has two orifices. So that's the designation on that. And then past that, it's telling me that I have a 110 degree nozzle. I have an O2 is the smallest they make in that, so they don't make them quite as small. And I go on from there. So let's play our scenario out again. We have 3 spray tips. So we're all the way to the right. We're going to run 9 miles an hour. We want to run 15 gallons per acre. If I look, the first one I run into is 14.5 on the Turbo TWINJET 11002. I run into that at 50 psi, and it's a medium-sized droplet. That's probably right there. I'm probably going to stop and say, yep, that's probably the one I'm going to use, because if I go to the 025, what I'm going to find is that I'm going to be operating in that 30 to 35 range. I'm going to have coarse droplets. I may want to go with the O2, but again, either one of those would work. What you'll find is the values, the actual value of the two charts we looked at, they're identical. On the O2 and the 025, the numbers are identical between the Turbo T and the Turbo TWINJET. But what's different? The different is that droplet size. So again, that's going to be something that's going to help me make that determination of which nozzle that I want to use. So,
we have a question from Jim if you want to take a minute.
Yeah, you bet. Let's take a question.
He says, what nozzle positions do you recommend for corn and soybeans for a fungicide and or insecticide application?
So Jim must have somehow looked forward at my presentation, because that's the slide I just pulled up.
All right, I'll keep going.
Yeah, perfect. Nope, that's a great question. And if you guys have questions, we'll take time at the end or just shoot them in. Jordan's monitoring that this morning. I want to stop if there's any questions. But let's go ahead and talk about common nozzle setup. So thanks, Jim, for the lead in. Here's some photos that we recently took just because we get this question a lot. Again, you know, there's a lot of flexibility in Undercover. A lot of you are going to play with it yourselves, and you're going to come up with what you think is best, whether it be a nozzle or orientation. So don't take these as the gospel. But, you know, we've obviously used this technology for a couple years. We've got a lot of experience, and these are our kind of personal favorites. You'll see on the left side that photo, we have the back cap. We have the back capped. So there's 4 nozzle positions. I'm going to call them the back orientation, the 2 sides, and then the one that comes up at a 45-degree angle. Typically for corn and sorghum, as you think about kind of your taller type crops, I really like to cap the back one and run the one at the top that comes back 45 degrees, because it's going to really shoot that solution up into the canopy and give me nice coverage for the top part of those leaves in that canopy. The side ones are going to do a good job on the ear leaf and above and a little bit below. You can adjust where you want that undercover. And I can't sit here today and tell you where to have it adjusted, because that is going to change depending on your crop size, where you're trying to target. If you're going after an insect that's in a certain spot, I know we've got a bunch of folks trying to get rid of the pesky sugarcane aphid down in sorghum right now, down south. And so a lot of those aphids live on the underside of the leaf, so they're going to position that, right where they want it. What I tell folks is, hey, get out in the field, kind of pull your sprayer out there and flip it on for a minute. Obviously, be careful of the product you're spraying, wear the proper protective equipment, but get out there and look at where that spray is going, and is it going where you want? And if not, either raise or lower your boom to control where the undercover is, or there are 2 set screws. You can kind of see it in the picture that you can quickly loosen and slide it if you need to on the riser. But back to Jim's question, in corn and sorghum, I generally like to run the top one and the 2 side ones, and I cap the back. In soybeans and wheat, again, don't have a lot of experience in cotton. Folks that are going to be working with that, again, I think you'll figure it out pretty quick for where you want that spray directed and which ones you want to use. But typically in soybeans and wheat, I'll run the 2 side ones, and then I'll run the back one. Where in the canopy do you run it? Typically, like I said, in corn, if you want to get coverage on your ear leaf and above, I'm probably going to have the bottom part of that angle of my side nozzle coming just at or below the ear leaf, and then taking it from there to get coverage all the way up. Maybe I want to run it a little bit lower. Maybe I want to run it a little bit higher. Same thing in soybeans. I tend to run it either mid to high canopy, depends on the size, depends on what I'm going after. Am I going after spider mites? Am I trying to get disease protection with an Endura type product for white mold, whatever that might be. In wheat, what we've seen is kind of running it at the top of the canopy, almost part in, part out, so that we're getting really good coverage on that flag leaf and on the head itself. So we don't really run it down in it. We kind of run it, I'll say almost half and half right there at the top of that canopy. Again, run it a little bit, see what kind of coverage you're getting, adjust if you need to. That's what I did over at Jim Hedges this summer. You guys saw the data from the pre-Axor trial we did there. When he took off, he went about 100 feet, and I thought we had it too low. We raised it up, and the results ended up being really, really good. So, part of it's playing around with it, but these are kind of our general guidelines. The next thing I want to point out, which just kind of builds on that question, is particularly when you think about a nozzle like a Turbo TWINJET that has an off-center orifice, meaning, you think about a flat fan, the hole's right in the middle, so it doesn't really matter a ton how you put that nozzle in, although you want to think about where, which direction the fan is facing. But on something like a Turbo T, it gets a little more important to really think about it when you actually put it in the undercover. And Justin and I, with our product support team, and I were out yesterday here playing in our test stand and looking at the different ways to put it in. So what I would tell you is, if you're in corn or you're putting a Turbo TWINJET nozzle in the top orientation of that undercover, I like to make sure that nozzle opening is upwards. It's up high. It's not lower. And it's a pretty big difference. We were playing around with it, and when you look at it, when you have it towards the top, higher to the sky, what you'll see is you're getting a really nice projectile. You're getting that aimed up, and you're going to get up higher in the canopy. If you have it flipped around the other way, it's going to be angled lower, and you're not going to get near as high into that V10, V12 type corn, or even particularly VT. So that is important, and it's something that we wanted to talk about this morning, and we're going to be getting a quick guide out to you guys here probably yet this week that has all these pictures on it. So you'll have a one-pager that you can take with you. Same on the side nozzles. Just make sure that the nozzle opening is towards the rear, meaning away from the undercover, away from, I shouldn't say the machine because you might have a front-facing machine, but you want it away from the riser, that opening. so that it's back further away. It's just giving it more room to clear the undercover, and it's giving it a little nicer angle pitch back to get good coverage, particularly as you're kind of creating that turbulence driving through the field. And then turbo twin, we have pictures here on the top nozzle. This is just more important to make sure that it's the orientation, that it's not sideways, that it's up and down, because the angle of those flat fans, you're going to get a lot better coverage with it facing vertical instead of horizontal. And then on the side nozzle, same thing. You'll want to make sure it's horizontal, not vertical in that case. So again, we'll get these pictures in front of you in a quick guide. Once you get into it and you look at it, it'll make a lot of sense to you. But it is something to just make sure we've got good orientation, so we're getting down to the details to get the best application that we possibly can. So with that, I will stop. I think we've still got 10 minutes or so for any questions. I don't know, do we have anything in the queue, Jordan? Yeah, so can I get by with 2 nozzles? Yes, you can. Again, it comes back to coverage, where you want it in the canopy and what kind of coverage are you getting. What we do find, and something that I like to do, and I know Greg Sauter has done this on his farm a lot, particularly even on his seed production after they cut the females and they come back and use undercover, we'll actually run 1 nozzle from the top of the boom and then run either 2 or 3 in the undercover. Particularly as we get into really tall corn, if we get into a VT type application or brown silk, sometimes to get good coverage, it's nice to have 1 nozzle coming down from the boom. And then a lot of times what I personally like to do is I'll run 2 in the undercover. So I'll run the sides, the 2 sides, I'll have nozzles in, I'll cap the top and the back, and I'll run 1 from the top of the boom. If you're doing that, that's a 3 nozzle orientation, and it'll make, you can just use the 3 nozzle orientation guideline in our nozzle selection guide that we just went through. If you do run 3 in the undercover, 1 facing up and 2 on the side, or even 1 back and 2 on the side and 1 from the boom, now you have a 4 nozzle orientation, and we don't have that called out specifically in our nozzle guide. You could call into our product support team. They can help you. You can actually use the 2 nozzle guide, and you can just use a factor of 2 on that. But I don't want to go deep into that today. If you have that question, call us. The only watch out with that is when you're running 4 nozzles, you're going to have to probably get to a pretty small orifice size unless you're running really high volumes. And I would, again, my personal opinion would be if you're running 4 nozzles, you better be at least 20 gallon per acre to make sure that you've got enough volume to get the coverage you want. And if you get 20 plus gallon, you can probably find a nozzle, particularly in a Turbo T, a 11001 or an 01015 that'll work for you. If you have specific questions like that, don't hesitate to call in excuse me, to our product support team. They can answer it, and if not, they can always get a hold of one of us that can help out. And if there aren't any other questions, I guess I'll go ahead and close out and just say thank you, and have a safe rest of your week.